A crowded courtroom hummed with quiet murmurs as people shuffled in their seats, eager to see the drama unfold. Today's case wasn't anything extraordinary, just another routine hearing where a young woman stood before the judge. She looked calm, composed, and oddly confident, but no one seemed to pay much attention to her. The real attraction of the moment was Officer Collins, a seasoned policeman known for his arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug grin playing on his lips. With a chuckle, he nudged the officer beside him and whispered just loud enough for others to hear, "Look at her, acting all tough. These so-called smart girls think they know everything. She's about to learn how the real world works." His voice dripped with mockery, drawing a few snickers from those who were listening. The young woman, however, showed no reaction. She simply adjusted the sleeves of her neatly pressed blazer and kept her gaze steady. There was something about her presence, something sharp and deliberate, but Collins was too busy enjoying himself to notice. The judge called the courtroom to order, and the session began. As the case unfolded, Collins continued to make side comments, clearly unimpressed by the woman's calm demeanor. "Probably just another law student trying to play hero," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "She won't last 5 minutes against real officers." Then the judge's voice cut through the air with a sharpness that made Collins sit up straighter. "Before we proceed, I believe it is important to formally introduce the special guest overseeing this session." Collins frowned. Special guest. He hadn't heard anything about this. He turned his attention back to the front, watching as the judge shifted his focus toward the young woman. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present Inspector General Sophia Carter of the Federal Police." A stunned silence fell over the room. Collins felt his breath hitch. His smirk vanished instantly. "Sophia, Inspector General." His mind raced as he watched her step forward with quiet authority. Gone was the image of a fragile, naive woman. In its place stood one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement, someone who outranked every officer in the room, including him. Collins' throat went dry as Sophia finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. The very person he had mocked, dismissed, and laughed at was now staring him down, and the weight of his mistake pressed heavily on his chest. The courtroom was silent, all eyes shifting between them. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This was no ordinary day in court, and he was no longer the one in control. And then, with a calm but chilling voice, Sophia finally spoke. "Officer Collins, I believe you had something to say about smart women in law enforcement." The air grew thick with tension, and Collins knew he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Collins swallowed hard, his mind scrambling for a response. The room was painfully quiet, the weight of 100 staring eyes pressing down on him. He had mocked her, laughed at her, without realizing who she truly was. And now, standing in front of him, was not some ordinary woman, but the highest-ranking officer in the Federal Police. He forced out an awkward chuckle, trying to mask his embarrassment. "Well, I." He stopped himself, unsure what to say. His usual arrogance had no place here anymore. Sophia didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't show anger. She didn't have to. The authority in her presence alone was enough to make everyone in the room uneasy. She simply waited, letting the silence stretch longer, watching Collins squirm under the pressure. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and broke the tension. "Inspector General Carter is here as an observer today, but it seems she has already become part of the discussion." There was a slight smirk in his voice, though his face remained neutral. "Shall we proceed?" Sophia gave a small nod. "Of course, Your Honor." Then, without sparing Collins another glance, she turned her attention back to the case. Collins let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, but his relief was short-lived. The whispers had already started. Officers beside him exchanged nervous glances. He could feel the stares burning into him, the unspoken judgment thick in the air. A few of his colleagues were clearly trying to suppress their amusement. He had been so confident, so sure of himself, and now he was the joke. But this wasn't just about embarrassment. This was about power. He had underestimated her, dismissed her, treated her like she didn't belong in his world. And yet, she was the one who held real authority. If she wanted to, she could make his career very difficult. The thought sent a chill down his spine. As the session continued, Collins barely heard a word. His mind was too busy racing, trying to piece together what to do next. He had spent years building his reputation, making sure people respected him. One mistake, one careless moment of arrogance, and now all of it was hanging by a thread. Then, something even worse dawned on him. This wasn't over. Sophia had let it slide, for now, but she hadn't forgotten. The way she had looked at him, the way she had paused before speaking, it wasn't just to humiliate him, it was a warning. He didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was certain. His troubles had only just begun. Collins sat stiffly in his chair, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Every few minutes, his eyes flickered towards Sophia, but she didn't look at him again. She was focused, listening carefully to the proceedings, her expression unreadable. But Collins knew better. She had noticed everything, and she was waiting. As the case went on, Collins tried to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. Maybe she wouldn't do anything. Maybe she was the type to let things slide, to brush off an insult rather than hold a grudge. But something told him he wasn't that lucky. The sound of the judge's gavel pulled him back into the moment. The hearing was wrapping up, and soon, people began shuffling out of their seats. Collins exhaled, relieved it was over. Until he saw Sophia rise from her chair. She moved with purpose, each step precise, controlled. He could tell she was headed toward him. Collins quickly stood, forcing a polite smile, but before she reached him, another voice interrupted. Inspector General Carter. A man in a dark suit stepped forward, his face serious. Collins immediately recognized him. Deputy Commissioner Harris, a man known for his strict discipline and no-nonsense attitude. He gave Collins a brief glance before focusing entirely on Sophia. "We need to talk," Harris said, his tone quiet but firm. "Something's come up." Sophia studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Of course, she glanced at Collins, as if she had something to say, but then turned away, following Harris out of the courtroom. Collins let out a slow breath, but the relief didn't last long. Something's come up. The words echoed in his mind. He didn't know why, but they unsettled him. Asterisk, asterisk. An hour later, Collins found himself sitting at his desk, staring blankly at the report in front of him. He had read the same paragraph 3 times and still hadn't processed a word. His mind was stuck on the courtroom, on Sophia, on the quiet, unspoken threat lingering in the air. He needed to find out more about her. If she was going to be a problem, he had to be prepared. A few clicks on his computer, and soon her personnel file was open on his screen. His eyes scanned the page, searching for something, anything, that might tell him what kind of person he was dealing with. Graduate of the top police academy, extensive field experience, several commendations. Then something caught his eye. Undercover Operations Division. Collins sat back, his pulse quickening. That wasn't normal. Most high-ranking officers climbed the ranks through administration, strategy, or politics. But Sophia Carter had spent years in the field, working undercover. That meant she wasn't just another bureaucrat sitting behind a desk. She was trained to blend in, to read people, to anticipate threats before they even surfaced. He felt a cold realization settle in his chest. She hadn't just caught him off guard today. She had studied him. She had let him reveal himself, let him show exactly who he was before revealing her identity. It hadn't been an accident. It had been calculated. And Collins knew one thing for sure. He was in deeper trouble than he had thought. Collins couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The courtroom incident had been bad enough. But now, knowing Sophia's background, he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. She wasn't someone who would let things go. She was the kind of person who played the long game, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the worst part, he had no idea when or how it would happen. The precinct was unusually quiet that evening. Most officers had wrapped up for the day, leaving only a few stragglers finishing paperwork. Collins sat at his desk, pretending to be busy, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying the moment in the courtroom, the way Sophia had looked at him, the weight behind her words. He had dealt with plenty of tough superiors in his career, but she was different. She wasn't trying to intimidate him. She didn't need to. She already knew she had the upper hand. Just as he was about to leave for the night, a sharp voice interrupted his thoughts. "Officer Collins." He looked up and his stomach dropped. Sophia stood in the doorway of the precinct, her eyes locked onto him. There was no anger on her face, no trace of the smirk he might have expected. Just calm, unwavering control. Behind her, Deputy Commissioner Harris stood with the same unreadable expression. "Step into my office," she said. Collins hesitated for only a second before pushing back his chair and standing. His palms were slightly damp, but he clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay steady. He wouldn't let her see him sweat. As he followed her down the hallway, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him. They weren't sure what was happening, but they knew enough to sense that this wasn't just a routine conversation. Whispers passed between them, but Collins kept his gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge them. When they reached her office, she held the door open and gestured for him to step inside. He did, and she closed the door behind them with a soft click. The room was neat, organized. A few framed commendations hung on the walls, alongside photographs of officers in the field. Collins took in everything, trying to gather whatever information he could. Sophia moved to her desk, but she didn't sit. Instead, she leaned against it, crossing her arms as she studied him. Harris remained standing by the door, his presence making the small office feel even smaller. "Do you know why you're here?" Sophia asked finally. Collins forced a chuckle, trying to inject some confidence into his voice. "I'm guessing it's not for a friendly chat." Sophia didn't react. "No, it's not." She let the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then she continued. "Tell me, Officer Collins, do you remember the Johnson case?" Collins stiffened. His heartbeat picked up, but he kept his face neutral. He knew exactly what case she was referring to. A messy situation from months ago. A case that should have been straightforward, but had too many loose ends. A case that, if anyone looked too closely, might uncover things best left buried. Sophia watched him carefully, waiting. And in that moment, Collins knew. Collins forced himself to stay calm, but inside, his mind was racing. The Johnson case, he hadn't heard that name in months. He had made sure of that. Yet here she was, bringing it up like a loaded weapon, waiting to see how he would react. He shifted his stance, crossing his arms in an attempt to appear relaxed. "Of course, I remember it. It was an open and shut case," he said smoothly. Sophia tilted her head slightly, as if she were studying a suspect in an interrogation room. "That's interesting," she said, her voice light but sharp. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks far from shut." Collins felt his stomach tighten. "I don't know what you mean." Sophia let out a quiet breath, then turned to Harris. "Deputy Commissioner, would you mind?" Harris stepped forward, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small flash drive. He set it on Sophia's desk and slid it toward Collins. "Play it," Sophia instructed. Collins hesitated for a fraction of a second before picking up the drive. His fingers felt stiff as he plugged it into the laptop on her desk. The screen flickered to life and a video file popped open. He clicked play. The footage was grainy, recorded from a security camera. At first, it didn't seem unusual, just a dimly lit alleyway, a few figures moving in the shadows. But then, Collins felt his blood run cold. He was in the video. There was no mistaking it. The timestamp in the corner matched the night in question. The same night he had written in his report that the suspect in the Johnson case had fled before officers arrived. But here on the screen, He could clearly be seen standing in that very alley, talking to someone. No, negotiating. Colin's pulse pounded in his ears. He remembered that night now, every detail. He had met with a man, a witness, or at least that's what he had called himself. But Collins knew the truth. The man had connections, people who wanted to make sure the case disappeared. Collins had done what he thought was necessary. He had taken the offer, rewritten the reports, ensured the case faded into the background. And now it was all right in front of him. The video ended, and the room fell into silence. Collins gripped the edges of the desk, trying to steady himself. He could feel Sophia watching him, waiting for him to speak. "You don't know what you're looking at," he finally muttered, his voice tight. Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Don't I?" Collins glanced at Harris, hoping for any sign of hesitation, but the man's face was unreadable. He wasn't here as a spectator. He was here as a witness. Collins sat frozen, his mind desperately trying to find a way out. He had handled tough situations before, talked his way out of tight corners. But this was different. Sophia wasn't someone he could intimidate or manipulate. She had the evidence, the authority, and, worst of all, the patience to watch him unravel. "I think," Collins started, his voice strained. "I think this is a misunderstanding." Sophia didn't move, didn't blink. She let his words hang in the air like a bad joke. Then she turned to Harris. "Deputy Commissioner, is there anything you'd like to add?" Harris sighed, stepping forward. "Collins, this footage is just the beginning. We pulled phone records, bank statements, and cross-checked witness reports. The inconsistencies in your case files go back further than just the Johnson case. You've been sloppy." Collins' stomach twisted. He had been careful, hadn't he? He had made sure no trails led back to him. His silence was answer enough. Sophia tapped her fingers against the desk, then said, "Here's how this plays out. You either cooperate and tell us everything, who you worked with, what deals were made, how deep this goes, or you take your chances when this goes public." She leaned in slightly, her voice unwavering. "And trust me, if it does, you won't just lose your badge, you'll lose your freedom." Collins clenched his jaw. "You think I'm just going to throw myself under the bus?" Sophia tilted her head, studying him like a puzzle she had already solved. "You already did." Before Collins could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. An officer poked his head in. "Inspector General, we have a situation." Sophia didn't look away from Collins. "What is it?" "We received an anonymous tip. Someone's trying to leave the country. Name's on your list." For the first time, Sophia's expression changed, just slightly. Collins caught it, and a realization struck him. They weren't just after him. There was someone bigger, someone higher up who had been pulling strings. Someone who had just panicked. Sophia exchanged a look with Harris, and without another word, she stood and grabbed her coat. "Collins, don't go anywhere," she said firmly before walking out, Harris close behind. Collins sat there, heart pounding. His world had been falling apart piece by piece, but now something else was happening. Someone out there, someone he had worked with, was running. And if they were running, that meant things were about to get much worse. He had been so focused on saving himself that he had missed the bigger picture. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one in danger. Collins sat in the silent office, his pulse still racing. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on him. He had spent years controlling situations, staying one step ahead, but now, for the first time, he was completely powerless. The realization left a bitter taste in his mouth. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. He could hear the commotion outside. Phones ringing, hurried footsteps, voices speaking in urgent tones. Something big was happening. Sophia had left in a hurry, which meant whoever was trying to flee the country was important. Maybe even more important than him. Collins let out a shaky breath. He had been worried about his own fate, but now he realized there was something much bigger at play. If someone in power was trying to escape, it meant the corruption ran deeper than he thought. And if that person was caught, they wouldn't go down alone. They would take others with them, including, most likely, him. The door suddenly swung open. Sophia stepped inside, her coat still draped over her arm. There was a shift in her expression, not victory, not satisfaction, but something more controlled. She had found what she was looking for. "It's over," she said simply. Collins swallowed. Who was it? Sophia sat down across from him, folding her hands together. A high-ranking official, someone who had a lot to lose if this case was fully exposed. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. "They were caught trying to board a private plane. We have them in custody now." Collins exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and dread washing over him. He knew what was coming next. "I assume they talked?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Sophia didn't need to answer. The look in her eyes was enough. Whoever had been caught had started naming names, and Collins had no doubt that his was on the list. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't expected. Not fear, not even anger, just exhaustion. He had spent so much time playing a game he thought he had mastered, but in the end, he had been just another piece on the board, one that had been sacrificed the moment it was convenient. Sophia leaned back slightly. "You have one option left, Collins. Cooperate. Tell the full truth. Help us clean this up." Her voice wasn't harsh, but it was firm. "It won't undo what you've done, but it might give you a chance to salvage something." Collins let the weight of her words sink in. He had spent his whole career thinking he was untouchable. But now, staring at the one person who had unraveled everything, he knew there was no escaping this. He gave a slow nod, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you need to know?" Sophia didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just reached for a notepad and clicked her pen. "Start from the beginning."